Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out here to the east of Siversk in the direction of Bilorivka, where the Russians have made a small advancement here to the south of the industrial zone here to the east of Bilorivka, and with this advancement the Russians have control over the eastern parts of Bilorivka, and it is likely they will continue to the Quark Chalk Hill here to the south of Bilorivka before moving into the central parts towards this village itself. With these developments, we see that the Russians are getting closer to the capture of Bilorivka with constant small advancements throughout the front, with no significant push, but a lot of positional fighting against Ukrainian positions throughout this section of the front line. The continuous advancements by the Russians has shown that the Russians are launching assaults using small assault squads of infantry to get closer and closer while under the cover of artillery fire. This advance was confirmed with this geolocated footage, and we also have additional geolocated footages by Rybart, which includes a lot of artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions in the section of the front line and continuous offensive operations by the Russians throughout the Siversk front, mostly positional. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Bakhmut by Ivanivske, there's continuous positional fighting with no significant changes in this section of the front line. We then move further south to the west of Avdiivka, where Russian offensive operations have restarted after a failed Ukrainian counterattack towards Orlivka. The Russians are now pushing the Ukrainians in three sections: in the north by Berdyizhny, in the center towards Semenivka, from Orlivka, and in Tonenke, where fighting continues in these three parts. Over the past 2 days, the Ukrainians have been launching counterattacks, and there's not a lot of footage coming out from those counterattacks. However, we have these pictures here, which shows the aftermath of one of such attacks. In this first picture, we see a sort of artillery system or tank that is completely blown to bits, which makes it difficult to identify what sort of vehicle it is. The second one shows two tanks which are abandoned, likely damaged from the counterattack and were abandoned by the Ukrainian forces. The third one shows a BMP or infantry fighting vehicle, which was abandoned by the Ukrainians following this assault. And finally, there is an APC, which was used to transport Ukrainian soldiers. This is likely one that has been abandoned because it was stuck in the mud. So we see that this Ukrainian counterattack failed, and the Russians have regained the initiative and are now storming in the direction of Semenivka. However, this section of the front line is very difficult for the Russians to pass through, because not only do the Ukrainians have fortifications to the south of Semenivka, we also see that the positions are located in the heights above the Russian positions at Orlivka, and there are several river lines and lakes here in between the two positions. So it's very difficult to pass through from this section by the Russians. The likely main push will come from the north by Berdyizhny. We're also seeing the main force of the Ukrainians trying to counterattack and recapture positions as fighting continues in this section of the front line. Inside of Tonenke itself, we have this geolocated footage which confirms some of these Russian advances within the village itself. And with this, we see that there's continuous progress by the Russians, and some of these previous advances were confirmed. Continuous positional fighting takes place as the Russians are looking to capture the rest of Tonenke, specifically the Dacha area and the northern parts, and then push further towards the next Ukrainian defensive line here to the east of Umanske, as the Russians will look to capture this to secure the southern flank of Orlivka. With control of Orlivka, the Russians could likely start a pincer maneuver where they'll attack from the south and from the north to trap the Ukrainian forces within the Dacha area, or to force them to withdraw from it without a fight. Moving further south here in the direction of Krasnodarivka, continuous fighting takes place, and with this geolocated footage here to the south of the city, we see that the Russians continue fighting within the residential area, which leaves the whole area as a gray zone. There is an armored effort by the Russians towards the fortifications and infantry assault groups towards the Ukrainian positions in the residential area. This shows that the positional fighting between the 3rd Azov Brigade and the Russian units here continues, and the Ukrainians have yet to push them completely out of the residential area. The fighting continues over this fortification here to the south. If the Ukrainians keep control of it, it will be difficult for the Russians to hold a foothold within the city, and the Ukrainians losing it would mean that the Russians would gain better control over the area and secure a foothold here to the south of the city. Moving further south in the direction of Marinka, there's continuous fighting here towards Rehorivka, with reports of Russian advances here to the south, but I'm waiting further confirmation. We then move on to the direction of Novomikhailivka, where yet again further reports of a fighting taking place, and we see this geolocated footage where we see Russian advances here in the central parts within the town. And with this further geolocated footage, we see additional advances by the Russians and continuous efforts by the Russians both to the north, south, and eastern parts of the town to continue advancing, and the Ukrainians sending additional reinforcements to the area to counterattack and hold the positions within the town. So heavy fighting is taking place here in the direction of Novomikhailivka, with hardly any advancements by either side, but there were some small advances by the Russians over the past 24 hours. Moving back north to the direction of the west of Avdiivka, we have to go into more detail about the fighting taking place, and to do that we have to take a look at why the Ukrainians are sending additional forces and reinforcements to this section of the front line to counterattack, despite these fortifications not really being that strong, meaning that the Russians could simply take advantage of these advancements and the counterattacks by the Ukrainians to end up in a battle of attrition here to the west of Avdiivka, where the Ukrainians will be in a position where the fortifications aren't really going to hold up that well against the Russian bombardment. To get a better understanding, we take a look at this article by the New York Times, headlined, "Surprisingly Weak Ukrainian Defenses Help Russian Advance." Russian forces continue to make small but rapid gains outside of the eastern Ukrainian city of Avdiivka, attributable in part to dwindling Ukrainian ammunition and declining Western aid. But there's another reason the Kremlin's troops are advancing in the area: poor Ukrainian defenses. Sparse, rudimentary trench lines populate the area west of Avdiivka that Ukraine is trying to defend, according to a Times review of imagery by Planet Labs, a commercial satellite company. Taking a look at these trenches, we see that there are a few trenches located here to the west of Avdiivka. The biggest issue with these trenches is that they aren't properly built. They are dug, allowing for cover and defense against artillery shells, the shrapnels flying around, but the fortifications themselves that are connected with these trenches are not built. This leaves only the trenches as the fortifications of the Ukrainians here to the west of Avdiivka. This means although there's numerous fortifications, they aren't really fortified. The biggest reason for this is, according to leaked information from insider sources from the office of the president of Zelensky, it is mainly due to the conflict that was between Zaluzhny and Zelensky, where Zelensky refused to build up the fortifications to the west of Avdiivka to prevent Zaluzhny from retreating from the city, because he had the intention to do so. If there was nowhere to retreat to, then he would refuse to retreat even in a disadvantageous situation, because the advantage would lessen even more if they were to fall back to fortifications that weren't properly built. This report is not adequate though, considering the fact that the fortifications in Zaporizhzhia are facing the same issue. The Ukrainians here expected to have much more success in a southern direction, where they then could take advantage of the fortifications the Russians had built to fortify their areas after their quote-unquote success in the summer offensive. But following the Ukrainian failure to capture Russian positions, we ended up in a situation where the Ukrainians did not properly build up fortifications. There are trenches dug up and there are fortifications built, but they are not nearly as well prepared and built as they need to be to hold back Russian advances. So what we are seeing is that the Ukrainians are suffering from three separate things: a lack of Western aid, a lack of infantry to deal with Russian forces, and finally, poorly built defenses. All of this added up together allows the Russians to make significantly more advances than what they could previously. This is why we're seeing the Russians attacking all throughout the front line and try to advance, and the Ukrainians being forced to send additional units, their best units, to counterattack, to try and hold the lines, to buy time for new fortifications to be built in the rear, to avoid the Russians simply breaking through their lines. However, the biggest issue here is, even if the Ukrainians manage to succeed to build fortifications in the rear at the cost of men buying time, they would lose significant manpower that will not be replenished due to the lack of Western aid and lack of mobilization prowess. The Ukrainian mobilization has significantly slowed down since the month of January, and right now it is hardly active considering the lack of information there and according to sources I have from there. So with this, we see that the Ukrainians are now lacking on both reserve manpower being built. There's no new mechanized brigades being built due to the lack of armored vehicles from the West. And with the lack of artillery shells, a lack of ammunition, they're taking even more casualties than what is needed. And with the poorly built fortifications, they have to commit their reserves to hold the lines. All of this adds up to a future Russian offensive in the summer or in the spring season towards the end of it throughout May. As Western media has been teasing, they have been reporting that the Russians will likely launch an offensive operation this summer. It is now even more likely to happen as the Russians will continue grinding down the Ukrainian forces throughout the next few months and build up their own in preparation for an offensive operation. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day.